Ready to explore the cutting edge of digital infrastructure? I'm Carrie Charles, your host of Let's Get Digital. Join me as we dive into the ideas, technologies, and leaders transforming the way we connect. From wireless telecom to fiber networks, data centers, and beyond. Sponsored by Broadstaff in partnership with RCR Wireless News. Now, let's dive in and let's get digital. Welcome to Let's Get Digital. I'm Carrie Charles, your host, and my guest today she's an incredible leader in the digital infrastructure space, but she's also one of my dear friends, and it is Ilissa Miller. She is the founder and CEO of iMiller Public Relations. She's the host of NDAS Live and editor-in-chief of Data Center Post. She brings nearly 30 years of digital infrastructure experience to the table, along with the perspective of a former elected trustee in Westchester County, New York. She's also the chair of OIX's Digital Infrastructure Framework Committee. Ilissa, so glad that you're here. Thank you for coming on the show. I'm just excited about this conversation.
I am so honored to be here with you, Carrie. And you know how much I really value your show, what you do, and all of your work because of our clients and what we do together. So, wow, the tables have turned. I get to be here this time. So, yeah, this is a pleasure. Thank you.
So we have recently at one of the events that we attended, I've seen you speak multiple times at conferences. You have been posting articles on LinkedIn that are so insightful. And we went to breakfast and I said, please, give me some insight, fill me in. And some of the things that you talked about were eye-opening for me. And I said, we have got to talk about this on the show. But first, I want to know, how did you come to work so closely with the data center industry? Where did you come from? How did you get here? And what perspective does that give you on the industry today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you mentioned in your intro, I've got 30 years experience in digital infrastructure. And that's the truth. I got into the space in 1996 when the Telecom Deregulation Act passed. And in 1999, I sold my first data center space. I sold co-location for a company in New York. And at that time, I sold it out in 6 months. They were going to buy a whole new building. But the truth is, at that time, I did not want to be a data center salesperson. I had liked the internet. And so I ended up going to work for an internet exchange and helped to build one of the first internet transit exchanges. It was Bandex, and it got sold to Arbanet. And so, yeah, I've been intimately involved in the data center space since 1999. I have been consulting and advising to and with data centers for the past 15 years. They have been clients of my company, iMiller Public Relations, since then. And I have been a customer and an evaluator and a partner, all of those things since 1999 when I first got my taste of data centers. So it's been a while.
So tell me about, it's iMiller Public Relations, but we abbreviate it sometimes to IMPR, right? So
IMPR.
IMPR. Yes. So tell us all about IMPR and what you do, who you serve, all of it.
Yeah. So, there's, our core business is public relations, right? Managing a company's reputation with its public, right? The standard, right? Press releases, announcements, and the strategy around that. We create messaging, identify who they are. There are various strategic things that we have and can do for companies. We've introduced new terms to the market. For example, before there were edge data centers, there was no definition of edge data centers or even that term. So we did introduce that to the market about 14 years ago as one of the examples of things that we do at IMPR. We introduce companies. We create strategic communication programs to help tell the company's stories so that when information is being shared in the market or salespeople are out there, that all of that can be corroborated through the stories of the company and the messaging that's out there. It's all rooted in facts and reality, right? Marketing tends to be a little bit more aspirational, whereas PR tends to be really fact-based. And it's interesting because, the business is changing and has changed since about 2021, 2022, when we first introduced the first master planned data center development. Remember, before 2021, nobody ever thought about master planning data centers until Josh Snowhorn at Quantum Loophole came along, and we launched his company and introduced the concept of master planning data centers. And that's exactly what we're seeing now, is all of these big developers, buying up hundreds, if not thousands of acres to master plan clustered data centers. Because when you look at places like Loudoun County, for example, Loudoun County, where you have clustered data centers, right? Data has gravity. It all needs to be there. So you can't just build really one data center, though you can. It makes sense to build a community of data centers so that information can be shared and exchanged all throughout. And so that's that vision. And those are just some of the examples of what we do and have done for companies. But like I said, things are changing, and more important now is getting more to the root of the matter, which is into the community, and having strong and purpose-driven community relations and intent there that can be followed through is the fastest growing side of our business.
So why do you think so many communities react so strongly to data center projects? And what do you think is usually missing from that conversation?
Yeah, listen. It's a really interesting time right now. The big thing, other than fear and unknown, is what AI is. Without definitions around AI and what that's going to be used for and how that's going to be used, the fear and anxiety of people are extremely high. You leave the opportunity for stories to be told when you don't tell people what the stories should be. So they're all coming up with these, fantastical ideas that they're going to take their jobs away and all of that. So let's take that as one, big uncertainty. But the reality is there's a lot of misinformation out there, and people are afraid of what they're hearing. Their livelihoods are at stake. They own houses, right? They've embedded in communities. Maybe they have businesses there. And they don't know how this digital infrastructure and these developments may affect them. And so they want to read and believe all the negative and bad news about property values going down, or about using all these resources and blackouts and all of these fear-based things. That's purpose-driven. That's propaganda in order to incite fear. And so where we're going wrong is tempering that fear and anxiety, which is appropriate, but it's appropriate when weighed with the facts. And we're not arming communities with enough insight to ask the right questions and to be empowered to engage and get the information that they need specifically for those projects. And there's a lot of reasons why that's happening. It's good development versus not good development. And part of it is being able to help communities understand, what does good development look like? What can you trust? And what can you count on as a result?
Well, let's go back to communication before we get to good communication, and then we'll get to good development. But when a company is introducing a data center project to a community, what does good communication actually look like?
It actually looks like listening. It's not even telling. Right? It's engaging. It's getting curious, right? Understanding, what is your appetite for digital infrastructure? What are the business needs in that community? Have you done polls and surveys to understand how businesses might be using technology or would like to use future technology that's being promised out there? And so there's that listening. There's understanding the concerns and the fears. It's hearing them, point blank, and being able to look people in the eye and letting them know that you intend to respond and answer all of the questions that they have. And stop. It's listening first, and then it's sharing and telling. And sharing and telling should be done in the most public way possible. We encourage companies to put up micro websites, to put out fact sheet information, and to share education information so that it is helpful for them to evaluate it in a fair and equitable way. But there's also a challenge in, the communities and the elected officials who have to make these hard decisions, the land use boards and, the trustees or supervisors in a particular jurisdiction. They have to be able to navigate this and have a vision for their communities. And when they don't have a vision for how digital infrastructure will benefit and impact their communities, it leaves a gap open for fear and anxiety to take over and to, really take over the conversation. And that's what we're seeing across the US.
So how should developers think about site selection, zoning, community fit, if they want projects to be received as good development rather than bad development? And just make that distinction in good and bad, if you will.
Yeah. So listen, we know what these data centers are. We know what it's going to take to operate them. It's a lot of power. It's access to potable water, right, for the, services on there. It's making sure that, there's enough land for buffer zones and things like that. So we know what things are good for. And when we're siting, most good siters are looking for already zoned land that is industrial zoned or light industrial or heavy commercial that can easily accommodate a certain size facility. A good developer is not looking to force a community to rezone a development to fit their needs. A good developer will find a already appropriately zoned property adjacent to power lines and connectivity so that becomes an appropriate place to develop. There's also plenty of brownfield sites, which are formerly old industrial sites, maybe aluminum smelter sites or paper mills or places like that have old industry on it, dirty old industry that had to be revitalized and remediated, and you have limited access to build there. Those are optimal locations for data center developments. And most of those sites already have even rail lines and power lines and, water lines going through it for what they were being used for previously. And now we have an opportunity to upgrade that into clean industrial for the next future. There's all sorts of areas all around this country that are ripe for the appropriate siting solutions. And it is a land grab, which is creating a lot of confusion out there because the opportunity for developers is so large that there's a lot of speculation or land development at simply the land use layer. And because a lot of communities haven't identified where data centers should go in their communities, the developers are trying to make that distinction for them and trying to drive that forward in these communities and encouraging them to do it. Some of them are right and some of them may not be right, but good development looks like it's going to revitalize an area. It's going to be in an appropriately zoned area. It doesn't need to be rezoned. It simply needs an acceptable use for the development. And that's where the confusion and challenges are starting to stem in the market, to be honest.
So where do you think the industry might be overbuilding? And where do you think it may not be preparing enough for what's coming next?
Yeah, this is a great question. I was at a conference a few weeks ago moderating a panel, and the question we asked the investors are we building for the right future? Right? Ooh. There's a lot of different type of AI uses, right? There's the LLMs, which are the large language modules, which is the learning. And that's what all these big AI factories tend to be. Then you have your inference AI, which is a little bit more at the edge, where inference AI will help with self-driving cars and things like that, where you need a low latency solution. And then you have agentic AI, which is basically an agent replacing a kind of human, and that agent has its own database and information, and you need to query that, and that might have some location specific requirements or latency requirements depending on what that agent does, right? And so when you think about this, right, we have a lot of different layers to the AI infrastructure outlook and what will be needed. And right now we're at the tip of the spear. And we are building for primarily the LLMs, right? For the learning and the training of the AIs. They need very large facilities. They need to have a lot of compute that talks to each other, that shares and learns and exchanges with each other. And that's where you're seeing a potential overbuild scenario. We don't know how much of that we actually need. Obviously, the large hyperscale developers, right, the big companies, right, who are driving that, they know what they need and they're looking for that. And they have their roadmaps out, but those roadmaps are not public, right? They're 5, 10, 15, 20-year roadmaps. And so we don't have that insight. And frankly, they can't really, bet on their own roadmaps without understanding regulation, adoption, and, maybe other things that might get in the way of how all this is going to roll out. And so we haven't even started the adoption hype cycle. We're simply in the build cycle right now.
So there's a lot of tension around data centers. Seems to come down to, resources like you talked about, like land and water and power. How should companies think about that responsibly when they enter a community or even maybe before they enter a community?
Yeah, it's really hard for the companies to do that and be the drivers of that with few exceptions. When it comes to investments, right? Especially with the power grid upgrades, there are a lot of companies that are now committing to paying their own way and making sure that they are covering the cost for the infrastructure that they need. There's a challenge with that in most cases because you can cover the cost for what you need, but you can't cover the cost for the entire grid load and how that might affect all of the users. And so there's a challenge there. For water use, developers and operators are already using and developing innovative technologies that have substantially reduced the amount of water that they need and use in their facilities. They're using closed loop systems, whether it's liquid cooling or water cooling closed loop. That is a way to continue to reuse water without having the need to replenish it. It evaporates much less. Yes, you're still using water, but nowhere near as much water as a golf course, for example, or a paper mill, for example. And so what's starting to happen is that we are using, energy and we are using, water, but we're not using it to the volumes that, at least the water, to the volumes that the market seems to think. And because it's such an emotional situation, that message isn't able to get through because there's so much disbelief in this entire process that it's really hard to get those facts through. The power situation is a big issue in and of itself. And other than paying our own way, I have to say that the utility companies and the energy companies have to help solve for this, right? And part of it is that they haven't upgraded the infrastructure in our country for a long time. And because they're being asked to provide such volume of megawatts and gigawatts of capacity, they have to upgrade that infrastructure. It requires much larger lines, right? Transmission lines, right? But I have to say, it's not just for the data centers that they're upgrading these facilities. It's for everything, right? And we've been having brownouts and blackouts and all of that, right? I've been on this planet for over 50 years. And in my lifetime, I had 2 blackouts. Before my lifetime, right, there weren't really blackouts. And so when you think about that, we need an upgrade on in the entire nation's backbone, but not just for data centers. It's for any future manufacturing, industrial, and high-end use for power. And without that, we're going to be limiting ourselves as a country.
So what does a real win-win look like between a developer and a community? And how often do you think that they get it right?
Depending on who you ask, you never get it right. And depending on who you ask, you always get it right, right? There's that thing. Listen, we're navigating a situation that's a paradox. It's both good and it's bad. If you're siting a development in the right location, let's call it a former, smelter site, for an example. That's a brownfield site. You have limited anything to build there. It's been sitting vacant for 20 years. How do you get that to work for your community? That's super smart development. That's when you're going in and you're saying, you've got limited use here. Here's what we're promising to do. We're going to continue to remediate it. We're going to add some, buffers here. We're going to provide parkland. We're going to contribute to the community. We're going to offer scholarship funds. We're going to, help with workforce. We're going to hire locally. We're going to work with the local unions and the local business associations. We're going to meet their needs locally as a priority. That's what good development looks like. Respecting and hearing the neighbors and making sure that you are not in proximity of neighbors, that you are further away. And if the zoning, here's the other thing that we don't always get right. Developers may find an industrial area that is appropriate for a data center development, and they may go in to do this only to find out that that development was rezoned for industrial by the community when it was a former something else. And that former something else might have been closer to the residential zones than a traditional industrial area might be. And therefore, right, what comes first, the industrial zone or the residential zone? And so we have to think of these things through. There's a lot of finger pointing when we don't really know the depth of the facts always. And so I'm really, good development is going in early, it's listening, and it's working with the community to address their needs out the gate. It's not getting it perfect. It's getting it right and right for that community.
So if the data center industry really wants to scale responsibly and solve some of these issues, earn the trust in the years ahead, what do you think needs to change the most right now? Maybe the one thing that needs to change.
The one thing that needs to change the most right now is making sure that when you are looking to develop your data center, you know what you are developing it for. Mm-hmm. What use is it? And that's what I think the big concern is from communities. What is this going to be used for, and who is going to use it? If you don't have those answers, it doesn't mean you still can't go forward. It doesn't mean that the site might not be the perfect site anyway. It just means that it may not be as real yet until you know what that customer and solution is that will be in that particular facility. And that means that a community should have concerns because they have a right to know who their neighbors are going to be.
So, Ilissa, tell me a little bit more about your work with, I mentioned earlier, OIX. You're on the Digital Infrastructure Framework Committee, but what does that mean? What do you do?
Yeah, so OIX is a not-for-profit organization. I sit on the board, and it's been around for about 14 years. The organization standards and certifications for data centers and internet exchanges. The idea was to create a platform of a baseline of best practices so that if you are choosing an operator or a service provider and they meet the standards, then they are doing things right. And so the Digital Infrastructure Framework Committee is an initiative that we launched in September of 2025 because we realized, or at least I realized, that part of the problem that we're having with municipalities is that they don't know what they don't know. They don't know how to navigate such a complex, large-scale development. It is multidimensional. It's not just, here's your land, and we can cite that for land. It's resources. We just talked about power and the utility company and water use. It's about connectivity and that kind of infrastructure. And so the Digital Infrastructure Framework Committee is working on a framework guidance document to help community planners, city planners, and comprehensive plan developers to think through how to think about digital infrastructure in their master plans. Part of this problem is that data centers are not an acceptable use in most communities' land use. You have to go in and request that acceptable use. Even though it's in industrial zone, right? The way that codes are written is codes are written to specifically tell you what is appropriate for an industrial zone. For example, one code did not say data centers, but it did say that you can have a junkyard there. So what would a neighbor prefer, a data center or a junkyard in their backyard, right? And that's that kind of thing of educating and letting people know it's really at a very granular level that communities have to make these decisions and think through. They need to be the ones in control. And because they haven't done this work yet, because it's so complex and it's hard to navigate, they feel like they might not be in control when the developers come to town and ask for all the things that they would like. And that's the big challenge right now. Who's wagging the tail, right? Is it the dog wagging the tail or somebody else?
There's no easy solution. These are very complex and complicated issues, as you said. But I love what you said about communication and listening. And I think that's just a basic human need is we want to be heard. We want to be understood. And I agree with you. I just don't think that's happening enough. So, if you could just simplify our whole conversation, I think that is a key point. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And that is exactly what we design our advisory programs on. For example, at iMiller Public Relations, IMPR, we have a program that's called Groundswell. Groundswell is a program that I drafted and launched back in 2022 on a particular project. It was used as a proving point to turn things around. And it was all based on engaging in the community, listening, outreach, putting your mouth, right? Talking, right? And acting on everything, that you're saying, showing the community that you mean business and that you mean business for them and that you're for their best interests. And it's rather complex. It's focused all on listening and proactive communications based off of what we're hearing and responding to, as well as providing access to fact-based information through micro websites and other fact-based information so that there can be no confusion about what is fact versus fiction.
And how do we learn more about IMPR?
IMPR, yes, please contact us. Our website is imillerpr.com. We also have Data Center Post. You can subscribe to Data Center Post. It's free and, get some insights here. You get blogs. You'll get a blog about this program for sure on Data Center Post. And you can find us on LinkedIn and reach out and ask any questions that you may have. I'm very passionate about, this, and I do think that there are ways to do it right. And I do think that not all development is good development. And so we work with companies that are trying to do it right. And that's what matters.
Ilissa, thank you. I just enjoy all of our conversations. I always learn something. I truly appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you.
Oh my God, Carrie, it's such a pleasure. Oh my God, your listeners have such a treat to be able to listen to you all the time as I do. And thank you for all the great work that you do for the digital infrastructure space.
Thank you. I will see you at the next event.
You got it.
Take care. Thanks for tuning in to Let's Get Digital. This podcast is powered by Broadstaff, a national staffing firm specializing in digital infrastructure talent. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and join me next time as we explore more stories at the intersection of technology, talent, and transformation. Until then, let's get digital.